for all the match strikers.
This is Spiritual Pyro.
Okay, no, but let's talk about how many conversations we are seeing and hearing and participating in where women are feeling a freedom and a permission to talk about what they want, what they desire, what they dream about, what they need, and in ways that feel really current and relevant and timeless. And we wrote about our own journeys into want and need and dreaming. We wrote about that years back when we first started, our manuscript. And we had always hoped that the things that we would be writing about would still feel relevant by the time our book flew out into the world. And I feel like that feels true right now. It feels like I'm seeing so many conversations. I'm hearing from so many women about connecting to themselves, returning to themselves in a way that leads them into their wants and their needs and their desires, whether that's spiritual or emotional or physical or material, like all the permission for all of it and that it all belongs. So that feels like, you and I in our respective therapeutic journeys, like it's a touchstone for us. And I hope a conversation that we get to continue with the women that we're in community with.
It's so true. I wonder, how much of that is because of the trauma that we experienced that almost made therapy, I'll speak for myself, inevitable. There was no way I could just sort of muscle my way through, power myself through the healing that was required. I needed help, which is hard to admit. It's hard to admit that on some level, but in the same way that I think it's hard to admit that we want things. And I think especially for women, it's harder to admit that we want things, and especially women who've come out of or are still within religious systems of some kind.
Yeah.
And I think that's very intentionally designed that way. Like it's on purpose that we learn how to be so detached from what we want and how we feel, what we need, being able to voice that, being able to be proactive enough to actually, it's an intimidating process, I think, to find a new therapist too. It's
Absolutely.
just, you don't just suddenly have a fantastic therapist. And sometimes it takes a few before you find someone that really you connect with and they connect with you and you feel safe and it works. So even just to take those steps on behalf of ourselves, to seek that out, that kind of support, I think says a lot, just about how committed we both were in our own ways to healing, to not letting what happened to us be our story forever.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's so many roadblocks to getting the help that we need, whether it's, most therapists aren't, don't take insurance, or, if you do find a good therapist, can you afford it? Can you squeeze it into your budget? Especially in a time of trauma when those things might not be as secure as they once were. And, for me, I remember driving across town. I drove literally my appointments, Gina's office was 55-minute drive. But once I found that person, and I remember her so generously giving me a reduced rate just because of the extenuating circumstances, I don't know if I would have pushed through if I would have had to go through 5 different people to find a good match, or if I had to pay $300 an hour, or I don't know if I could have done that, so I think that therapy is, I think it's more and more accessible than it's ever been. And at the same time, a lot of us are just trying to figure out our regular family budget, much less an additional thing like therapy. So it can feel out of reach too, which is just part of it. It's all a very, it's a significant act on behalf of ourselves. One that isn't always available. But I also think too that it's just so interesting that we think we go to therapy for one thing, right? We both knew exactly why we were going to therapy back in 2018. It was very clear what we needed help with.
Clear. Yeah.
what we needed to process, what we needed, support for. And I mean, you and I have talked about this, but I went into therapy thinking I was going to be working through one specific thing. And of course, because this is how it works, therapy and all of those processes just bled into so many other areas of my life, which is a little unnerving. I mean, when, you've got something that you're working through and that's enough, but then to actually know you walk in thinking you're going to deal with one thing and it ends up being about so many other things. There's a lot of what Gina would say, untangling to be done. So therapy for me was really just untangling this really big knot. All of these things that were enmeshed, all of these things that were overlapping and tangled up with each other. And it was no small thing.
No small thing. I think that's so true, which I think also that can feel so intimidating because it's asking for a vulnerability that's out of our control in some ways. I mean, we always have control and a certain consent, all those things.
Consent.
But there's an element of vulnerability in opening yourself up to, you don't really know what you're going to find. Like you said, you go in for one thing and then the untangling, I was going to say unraveling, same, is that, well, we don't really know how far this is going to go or where it's going to take us or what we're going to find. And that's kind of terrifying,
Absolutely.
But one of the places that it took both of us in our own individual journeys is into this conversation around want and need and desire. And I think the way that that's manifested, we touch on certain points. I love the way that you write about specifically one element that Gina brought into your life that was a bit of a love-hate. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that if you feel comfortable sharing.
I will never forget sitting across from her and her handing me this yellow composition notebook, like the ones that you have in high school. Well, at least we did back in the day when everybody still used pens and paper. Yeah. And she told me that she wanted me to write down right there. She wanted me to start writing down a list of things that I wanted, things that I needed, and things that I dreamed about. When she gave me the instruction to write the word want at the top of the first page, it felt cruel because I was sitting in her office with no home, no car, hardly any money, no job, no place to call my own, nothing. I mean, we had sold most of our belongings before moving overseas and came home so abruptly that we didn't have a plan in place. So the fact that I was even able to sit in her office was a miracle, but I sat there with nothing. And she was asking me to write down what I want. It felt impossible. It felt absolutely impossible. And then she told me to write the word need at the top of the next page. And I burst into tears because I was like, the list is too long. Like, I need everything. And she was like, write it down. I was like, the littlest things. I need the littlest things. And she's like, write it down. And then she told me to write the word dream at the top of the third page. And I was pissed by this point. I was like, what do you mean dream? Like, I used up all my dreams. Like, I tried everything I could think of. I went as far as I could go. I took my faith as far as I could take it. What do you mean dream? Like, I'm just trying to get from day to day. So this practice that she wanted me to participate in felt, it was a visceral reaction inside my body. I didn't want it. I threw the notebook down on the table. She was basically looking at me like, okay, take a breath. And I remember her saying, when we got through that session and I had come around to the idea that maybe I could allow myself to want. maybe I could allow myself to say out loud and to write down with the pen to the page the things that I need. Maybe if I could allow myself to dream again, which is my nature, always has been.
Hmm.
Maybe if I could allow myself to do those things, to be embodied in that way, maybe I could return to myself. Maybe I could find myself again. The things that had felt dormant, the hope that felt lost, maybe I could find that again. And I remember her saying at the end of that session that she would hold joy for me until I was able to hold it again for myself.
Wow.
And that was a profound moment. She was just going to hold out joy for me until I could hold it for myself. So I took that damn yellow notebook home and I was so pissed about it, but I started. I just started. And I started kind of with like the biggest, most audacious thing I could think of. That was the only way I could go. It was the only way I could begin, was just, jumping in head first. And so I did. And I wrote down the biggest things I could dream of and the littlest things that I could want or need and everything in between. I hated every single minute of it until I didn't, until I started to remember who I was.
That's incredible. How long do you, if you were to, take a guess, how long do you think that process took, just from the time you first wrote down want, need, dream, started filling it in? Was this like a few months? Is this a practice that you continued for a long time, years? Is this a couple weeks? Like what was that like for you?
It's still hard. I still do it. It's part of me now. It's part of how I look back and it's part of how I look forward. So I still have those little wants and needs and dreams that I write down, and they're not always in the damn yellow notebook. That's part of my archive. Sometimes they're in my notes app. Sometimes they're in a text message to you. Sometimes they're in, they're on a Post-it note on my mirrors. They find their way and weave their way into lots of different spaces in my life now, but it's a practice. And all three of those things get to have their moment. All three of those things belong: the wants, the needs, the dreams, all of it. Yeah. So but it's still hard today. I find myself sometimes having moments where I'm like, oof, hard to admit, hard to allow. And I have to practice giving myself permission again and again.
I just think it's so profound to think about, even the hope that Gina was able to hold for you when you couldn't access it yourself. And you were such a naturally hopeful person that to imagine that you had gotten to a point where you couldn't reach out and name those wants and those needs and those dreams. And it just makes me wonder, like, I'm curious from your perspective, how would you, what's the difference between want, needs, and a dream? How would you say those are different? Yes.
So want felt simpler. Want was really, really, I knew exactly what was on that list. It was things that I didn't need, I could live without, that were, not imperative for me or anyone else in my family. And that was the key, is that these lists had to be about me, not about my husband, not about the kids, not about anybody else, just me. So the wants were like flowers from Trader Joe's, or the wants were like the hummingbird feeder for the backyard. The wants included things like new pillowcases, things that I could live without, but I just wanted, just because they would be nice and it would bring a small amount of joy or a small amount of hope in a moment where, with flowers at Trader Joe's, they're going to die. They're cut flowers. They're going to die within a week, and then you have nothing to show for it. So that felt like a luxury, to want something that I wouldn't have anything to show for a week later. And then a dream was more like, where do I see myself in the future? What are the goals I want to work toward? What are the experiences or the environments or the atmosphere that I want for myself So those things were more about building things, creating things, making. Those dreams felt big and expansive and like they could find their way in the stars, like those things were what filled my lungs and helped me sit up taller in those moments when my posture was so hunched over and concave. So the need was more things that was hard to admit. Like, yeah, like after living for 2 years in the subtropics, like I needed new underwear. And it was hard to allow myself to buy it. Like things like that, where you're just kind of like, oh yeah, no, it's not necessarily something that you really want to write down on a list. It's not really something that you want to admit is difficult for yourself. Those basic needs that were even so difficult. But I think one of the things that became really beautiful was the feeling I would get on either of those 3 lists and crossing things off. It wasn't like a task. It was like a little altar. It was a little ritual. It became sacred to look at the list and be like, okay, today when we go to Target, we're going to hit that 5 for $25 bin. And then to cross it off the list and be like, yep, I know, honey. I know. I would put that's when I started the practice of putting my hand over my chest and being like, I know, honey, I know. Like, this is hard. It's hard and we're going to do it anyway. And nobody in this store has any idea the sacred moment that is happening right now at the 5 for $25 bin.
Right. Who knew?
Yeah.
It's the way that this process, this practice almost left like little breadcrumbs that you followed back to yourself. And in that process of, like you mentioned, crossing things off the list, when you talk about empowering and embodiment, it's that pathway back that you created for yourself. I mean, you designated the list. You were the one who crossed those things off your list. And just kind of the audacity to believe that you are worthy not only of having like your needs met, but also the dignity of being able to buy yourself flowers. So I'm going to Miley Cyrus style, like to be able to buy these things for you, or like when it's the joy of even just like freshly washed sheets. When you said pillowcases, I'm like, oh, that feeling when like everything is clean and fresh from the dryer, and you're just like, I am a princess. I'm going to bed like a princess. It's just the dignity of that, the kindness of that, and to believe you're worth that.
Whether it's on the heels of trauma or whether it's just being a mom and your constant focus is providing for everyone else, or whether it's just being a woman in the world, having to struggle to believe that you're worth your own investment, whether that's time or money or energy, And Sarah, Barbara really challenged you with that. When you were working in your sessions with her, she really challenged you. I would love for you to speak to that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also so true in that. But one of the things that I had been so detached from my physical self, my physical world, as almost it was part of my trauma response, was survival mode, which was just don't feel anything, and kind of just power through and be there for everyone else. And in a lot of ways, I was avoiding my own connection to myself in response that way. So in the slow returning to myself that, unfolded across so many desert trails over the first, 18 months or so of moving back to Arizona back in 2018. One of the things that did not easily come back to me was the ability to really answer the question. I remember sitting in a session with Barbara, my therapist, and this was during COVID, by the way. So I hadn't met Barbara. We just did Zoom sessions, which was really interesting. I actually think, side note, as an introvert, being able to be in my own space and sort of have my own environment experience allowed me to, I think, open up a lot faster than I would have if I was driving to an office and sitting in a waiting room and sitting across from another client and then going, just the whole experience is just really different. And I just think that's interesting because there's so many ways to access care, right? There's so many
Yeah.
ways to access that kind of help and support. And for me, that was a new one and it was a forced one. It was COVID. Nobody was meeting in person really. But I'm actually really glad that it worked that way. And it was a couple years before I actually met her in person. And it was a really fantastic moment. It's so
Love that.
surreal. You're like, oh my gosh, you're a real person. You real. But I'll never forget the session with her where, she'd been so patiently walking with me through my own journey of really detachment from myself and my actual life. And as I started to kind of come back to myself, there was this kind of glaring gap when it came to my ability to really do anything that wasn't the benefit of someone else or wasn't for a specific need. It didn't have, it would be, I would use words like, that's so frivolous. That's so selfish.
Yeah.
Again, the audacity, like,
Ooh.
I don't need it. So I'm fine, and the less things I needed, the less vulnerable I had to be. And coming out of such a traumatic experience, it was really scary to think about letting my life be big enough that I got to take up space in it too. Yeah, which is, again, that's a bigger conversation that I hope we circle back to, whether it's in this episode or a future one, just about why is it so damn hard to take up space in our own life? It's that scene in The Holiday where I forget who it was, Kate Winslet, I think. She's like, I should be the main character in my own life, the leading lady in my own life.
Yeah.
It's like that. So true. How often we're living our life as a supporting cast member.
But think about that. Really, that's part of how the system that we were handed works. We were conditioned within high control religion to where that's how you get the jewels in your crown.
Oof.
That's the Proverbs 31 woman, right? Like, that's what we were handed. We were handed the idea that the less you need, the less you want, the less space you take up, the more you pick up your cross and carry it, the more you deny yourself. That's the goal. Like, that's who we were supposed to aspire to be. And shit, you give us a goal and we're going to knock it out of the park, right? So we were professionals at denying ourselves.
Oof.
So it's no wonder that we were detached from our bodies. It's no wonder I threw that damn yellow notebook across there. That was the exact opposite of everything that we had known. And that's why the unraveling got so messy, was because we weren't just unraveling the trauma that we had experienced. We were then unraveling the faith foundations that undergirded the whole damn thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, within the faith system and outside of it, even just culturally. Just, again, the messaging that we grew up with through our childhood, through our, adolescent years as women. It's everywhere, that messaging that we, in so many different ways, that we're supposed to be so small and so good. And so Barbara asked me this question that just threw me on my heels. She said, and it sounds so simple, I'm embarrassed to even say it. But she's like, what do you do for fun? What do you do for play? What is play for you? And I remember I just kind of sat there blank, totally, completely had no answer for her. And I had almost an out of body moment where I was almost observing myself and going it feels like something a person should be able to answer pretty easily, right? That feels like something I'm surprised that I have absolutely nothing to say. And I kept trying to think about things, but everything that I brought up was related in some way to benefiting the greater good. That's the family or a friend or, just in general, it was, I had only allowed myself the joy of play to the extent that it benefited someone else. It's how I justified what felt indulgent or it felt selfish. Yeah. Yeah.
Whew.
So, Barbara's like, well, maybe we should like explore that a little bit, like almost like gold mine.
Barbara.
That's it. That's one of those points you like, yeah, crossroads. You're never going to be the same once you hit one of those moments, I think. And then, it became this question that I had to answer for myself. I wanted to know the answer to that question. And I wanted to know why I didn't know the answer to that question. So when I refer to the selfish, first of all, you have to picture that scene in Schitt's Creek where Dave and Alexis are talking about whose turn it is to take a selfish, because every time that's what it became for me, was like, I get the selfish. It's my turn for the selfish. You got the last selfish. And really, it was sort of this like way to kind of challenge myself to reframe the word as being negative. Like, ooh, always the negative connotation. You're so selfish. That's so selfish. And really kind of just asking myself the question, like, what if it's not a bad thing to be selfish?
Yeah.
What if we've been calling it that, but what it really is like self-care or self-love? Like that whole idea of taking up space is, who told you that that's selfish, right? It was kind of that question. When did that become the way it is? And so, I mean, there are different ways that I tried to practice it. My commitment was just to try to take at least do one selfish a month. And the first one that I did was actually, I used up some of our family's hotel points and went and stayed at a hotel just 20 minutes away, just by myself. And it was hard enough to make the decision to like use the points, like the family hotel points. It felt selfish. But I knew if I try to figure this out and even just start this journey, this process in the four walls of this home, I'm going to be thinking about laundry. I'm going to be thinking about, I should be vacuuming. I've got to go do this. I've got to go. There's no way. There's no room. There's no space to even consider myself within this home, because I had spent so many years training myself and everyone else to think about me in a certain way. So I didn't even know. So for me, it was really important to get some space, just so that I could ask the question without having any other background noise going on in my head. Yep. And it was stupidly hard. It was ridiculously hard. I paced the hotel room. I felt so guilty. Should was so loud in my head. I should be doing this. I should be doing that. Oh, it was like, I should be working on edits. I should be working on the new thing. I should be this call. I should do, so many things that I was shocked at how difficult it was for me to actually relax and, just be. And part of that was coming out of, again, all the stress and trauma that we'd experienced. My body was in hyper alert mode. It didn't know how to relax. And it was this really on purpose practice of, no, we're going to sit here. We're going to take up the space. And no, you can't go home early. You got to stay here for the full 24 hours, baby. Like you're here. This is your selfish. And it really set a precedent for me that, it's interesting looking back and talking about that very first experience of selfish now, because that practice has become so integrated over the years, where I'm able to access that without needing so much space. I've built that practice into my life. But at the time, it was impossibly hard. And I remember feeling embarrassed. Like, I'm embarrassed that this is so hard. I feel shame. Like, it was just such a wake up call. Like, whoa, how did we get here? I thought I was this independent woman who was super self-aware. And, it's like something as simple as play took me out, Another time I grew up on a horse ranch in Arizona. I grew up riding horses. We live in the Midwest now. And at the time, I didn't have any interaction or involvement with horses anymore. And it's always been like my first love. And there's been this had been for years, this sort of separation from, like, it was like I wasn't allowed to feel that kind of joy anymore, or I didn't want to get my hopes up almost, or get attached to something I couldn't have. It was like too much goodness. And I remember one of my selfishes was looking up a barn nearby and driving myself to the barn and just inquiring. And Corinne, I was like, my hands were like shaking. I remember walking up to the like front desk in the ranch house and knowing like I'm going to ask them about, horseback riding lessons for adults and like what their programs are. And I was like, I almost chickened out. And I almost didn't do it. I was so nervous just to take up that kind of space for myself. And I remember walking out, and the gal that had helped me was so sweet. She's like, well, if you want to just walk around, you can stay as long as you want. And I just like walked from stall to stall, and the smells and the sounds and the little fuzzy horse noses. And just, it was such a gift to myself. And it was like 10 minutes down the road, and I could have done any other time. And it's so wild how I'll say, it was like I was keeping myself from that kind of play, that kind of joy, that kind of happiness. Yeah. And I don't know, the act of choosing that we're worthy of that kind of joy and happiness, choosing to believe that doesn't make us selfish, that it doesn't make us indulgent, that we're allowed to be complex, and we're allowed to do more than just scrape by with the bare minimum. It was revolutionary for me. And it's a practice that I continue to this day. I take my selfishes in all kinds of ways. And now it's become so second nature. And, one of the things I think I'm most glad about in that is the way that I have rewired the way that I function within my family. So that's good not only for me, but that's good for my husband. That's good for my daughter. It's good for my son, right? But it's still, I'm still centering myself in that, which is not selfish in this example, right? It's not. And so it's still hard sometimes. I relate to what you're saying about, it's not like one day you wake up and you're like, I'm cured. Everything is easy now. Right. Like it's still hard. But I know what I'm working with, like it's sort of that, like you're learning a new language and you sort of figure out like, okay, I know what's going on here,
It's musculature, right? Like when we always talk about we have the musculature, but sometimes there's certain parts of that have to get rebuilt. Those muscles we haven't used in a really long time that have atrophied, and then we have to work really hard and diligently to like build back that strength. I'm just picturing you in that ranch house with a little quiver in your voice, asking about the horses, asking about lessons, like allowing yourself to want something I feel like it's so fragile. It's so vulnerable because it once you let it out of the cage, you can't get it back in. Once you admit you want something, once you admit that something feels like hope or feels like yourself or feels like joy, oh my gosh, you feel so exposed. Right. And I always think about the phrase, I don't want to get my hopes up. And it's like, nobody says that unless their hopes are already up. Like you're not aware of hope unless your hopes are already up and you're feeling really exposed or fragile about that. Right. So it's like with want, once we admit what we want, then it's like, oh man, like the risk of disappointment feels so great. Like, what if you can't afford it? Or what if you don't have time? Or what if, right? Like, what if whatever it is that you most fear is going to be the reason that you can't have something or do something or become something? Our hopes are already up. And so you walk in that ranch house. I mean, you write about your girlhood with horses. I love how you write about it in Palomino in the book. And I hope that anyone who's listening to this episode has a chance to read that, because you take us to that place in your girlhood so vividly that, like, I know I have a very clear picture of you walking into that ranch house that day because of it.
Wow.
So I love that. And I'm thinking about Barbara and that question that still lingers with you. And I'm thinking about the question that Gina asked me, where she was like, who would you even be if everything didn't have to be so hard? I burst into tears. Tears basically for everything that Gina would say to me. Yeah.
Same.
But the idea, like, who would you even be if everything didn't have to be so hard? And that question was on the heels of unraveling so much of my martyrdom, so much of the victim mentality that I had taken on and put on my own shoulders through religion. This, it's okay, I didn't want it anyway. It's okay, I don't need it anyway. I'll sacrifice, I'll do whatever the hard thing is. That idea that gets so rewarded had woven itself so deeply into my ideas of who I was or what I could want in life, that when she asked me that, who would you even be if everything didn't have to be so hard? I had no answer. I don't know. Because everything has been hard for as long as I can remember. And the question of why? Because that felt spiritual. That felt like the calling. That felt like the goal. If things were hard, then you must really be, sacrificing for the Lord, or you must really be, serving other people, or you must really be outwardly focused, and all those kinds of phrases that, were so normalized for us for so long, that I didn't have an answer to that question. But what that question did do in that moment was it implied that there could be a different way for me to move through the world that didn't have to be martyrdom. It didn't have to be victimhood. It didn't have to be purposefully putting myself in situations that would be difficult as if there was going to be a trophy at the end, right? Mm-hmm. I wanted so many trophies. I wanted the gold stars. I thought that was the goal. I wanted the approval. I wanted that measuring stick, those metrics, to know that I was on the right path. That's all I ever cared about, was tell me what the right path is, and that's the one I want to be on.
It's wild to me, Corinne, that neither of us had answers for those seemingly simple questions. I feel like it's also really telling, though. Like, it makes me wonder who benefits from keeping women so disintegrated from our power and our connection to ourselves, but also to one another. Like, what systems are designed to keep women so small? What policies and rules and theologies have been set in place to separate women from themselves and one another? I mean, I feel like we already know that patriarchy is absolutely dependent on it. And keeping women small and tired and distracted and disconnected from our joy is like a keystone practice in countless churches, nonprofits. I mean,
Yep.
We know that. We know that to be true.
Yep.
But I keep thinking, too, that like as we wake up and we begin to take some ground back, like when we admit we want something and we actually go for it, when we answer those questions for ourselves and act on behalf of ourselves, that becomes a ripple that rebuilds our own atrophied muscles and empowers those around us to do the same. And oh my gosh, that's the magic. That's the power. Mm-hmm. Whew. Because the truth is, the more integrated that we become, the less bullshit we're willing to put up with.
Whew. Yep. That's the audacity. That is the rising up of all of us. That is the lanterns lifted high. That is the bonfires on the bluff. That is the light. Those are the flares we are sending up. Like, that's the audacity. To feel like there could be a better way, to feel like we could belong to ourselves, return to ourselves. And it's catching. So these responses that we're already hearing, the Me Too's and the with yous that we are already receiving, we know we're not alone. And we know that this is happening around bonfires that we've not even been to yet. We know that there are women out there, that there are groups, that there are communities out there that are already gathering around their own bonfires. But the audacity to rise up after something difficult, man, that is no small thing. That is the most beautiful thing.
So true. And to do it together, to do it collectively. To find these match strikers out, along the desert trails with us as we go. It's just the most incredible thing. And I'm so glad we're here and we get to do this work.
You've been listening to Spiritual Pyro with Sarah Carter and Corinne Shark on the 1C Story Network. For more information about this and all of our stories, please visit just1c.com. That's JUSTONEC.com.
Boom, done.
The 1C Story Network, for the love of stories.